Today we will be talking about methods and approaches in conducting research in literature, which is also called the literary criticism. Here we haven't talked yet about thesis, okay? We talk about the research alone. Thesis is just, as I mentioned last week, one way to express the result of your thesis, one way to report the result of your research. And now we are still talking about the research. Last week, okay, let me review, okay? We talked about the definition of literature, the extended definition of literature, which covers all aesthetic works related to language, right? We talked about literature covering poetry, prose, and also drama, and wider yet, you have movies, comics, and many other forms of aesthetic works which use language. And we also talk about literary research, what I meant by literary research, which is an attempt to answer questions or to solve problems related to a literary work using specific sets of steps or stages to solve the problems or to answer the questions. And that's literary research. I also mentioned to you that you can present the result of literary research in the forms of a thesis, an essay, a video, any other ways of presenting the results of research. What we happen to be doing at this semester, in this semester, is preparing you to write a thesis. So our discussion on research here, although it is very general, eventually it will lead to you writing your thesis. And we also discussed questions that you can pose when you do research in literature. And what I mentioned to you last week was that the questions that we can ask in literary research are elaborative questions, whether they are informational, talking about objects, place, or time related to a work that is not clearly stated in the work, which is that's why it's called informational, or whether it is explanatory, such as to explain how something happens or what causes something or what the effects of something are. Or you can also do the evaluative questions. You can propose evaluative questions, questions that are related to values, how you see things, related to ethics, about right or wrong, good or bad, ethical or unethical, and so on. And these questions, as I also commented on your posts on MS Teams, these questions are supposed to be questions that you cannot find the answer explicitly in the text. If you can find the answer explicitly in the text, then, well, you don't need to do a research for that. Okay? That's why when we talk about elaborative questions, I mentioned to you that when we have elaborative questions, we need to have more external information to answer it than internal information. Information from the text alone, they only give you indications of answers, but they cannot provide you with actual answers or conclusive answers. If you want to have a sufficient answer, an adequate answer, you need to involve a lot of information from outside. And yeah, what research question is good for literature, I just mentioned to you. Now I want to give you a more specific, okay, a more specific set of questions that you can pose. The question can be related to the world or the universe in relation to the work. Vis-a-vis means in relation. So it can be a question on the work in relation to the world or the universe in Abram's article that you have read. It can be on the work in relation to its authors or its artists, or it can also be on the work in relation to the audience. So there are so many questions. For this one, if you want to ask a question on the work in relation to the world or the universe, you can provide elaborative questions like what I just mentioned to you, okay? What we did last week was mostly on the work in relation to the world. But there were also some people who asked questions in relation to the writer, the person, the artist. For this one, you can ask elaborative questions like this. And yeah, the answer cannot be pinned down easily on the work. Now, this is one idea that I might not have mentioned to you last week. When somebody creates a literary work or creates a work of art, that person doesn't give you the whole world, right? There's only so much you can write in a literary work. That's why when somebody writes about a son who cannot kill his mother, but eventually saves his mother in the dungeon, for example, or in the not dungeon, I'm sorry, in the basement. We cannot get the description of the basement. We cannot get the description of what the mother's clothes look like, or what kind of house they live in. We cannot have that. And these are what we call blank spaces. There are blank spaces in the literary work that we cannot really get the information of. And blank spaces like the community. What kind of community does this man live in? We don't really know. That's a blank space. We can only make inferences. We can only guess from the king, from the relation between the king and the subjects, and from the relation between the son and the mother, and so on. So we cannot really tell what kind of world it is. We cannot really tell what kind of clothes they wear. We cannot really tell what the king actually feels in his heart, in his mind. So these are the blank spaces. What we as researchers are doing usually is to find what these blank spaces are, or to explain how these blank spaces actually look like or might look like. So when we talk about the work in relation to the world, then we need to address these blank spaces. We need to explain these blank spaces. I will give you an illustration later on. Now, you can also talk about the work in relation to the artist or the writer. And when we talk about something like this, we need to we can make questions related to the motivation of the writer. And how do we know the motivation of a person? Motivation here is a technical term. When somebody says motivation, it should not be considered as the intention or why somebody does that literally. No, motivation is a collection of all things that influence somebody to create something. For example, there is a murder in the city of Malang. The perpetrator, the killer, might say that I murdered him because he insulted me. He insulted me. He called me, for example, a liar. then that's his intention, but that is not his motivation. How do we know the motivation of this person? We know the motivation through seeing what kind of person he is, what kind of life he lives, what kind of house he lives in, what kind of attitude people have towards him. Maybe people around him have been denigrating him, have been bullying him. Maybe he lives in poverty and he has done so many things, but still he cannot avoid poverty. He cannot escape poverty. And when somebody insults him, then everything here creates an impact, which is okay, murder. So that's the motivation. The motivation is not the intention only, it's not the purpose of that person, but it's a combination of a lot of things around the world, around this person. And with regards to a writer, the motivation of a writer in writing a work is not only because I want some money, because I want to sell something, because I want to entertain a person, because I want to express my feeling. No, it's not that. But it's related to the social situation around this writer, what kind of country he lives in, what kind of family he lives in, or she lives in, for that matter. Okay, I cannot limit it to men only, right? And we also call up, yeah, we need to consider the social situation, the personal situation, or the emotional situation of the person, and many other things. But basically, all of this eventually will help us to find the motivation of the writer. In the case of the aged mother, we can say that the motivation, I don't know what the motivation is of Matsuo Basho in writing that short story, but if we want to find his motivation, first of all, we need to look at the work, of course, what kind of work it is, what the story of the work is, and what kind of situation or what kind of social situation Matsuo Basho lived in, and what kind of religious teachings did Matsuo Basho follow. So all of this eventually will help us in determining or explaining what the motivation of Matsuo Basho was when he wrote that short story. Now, we can also ask questions on the work vis-a-vis the audience. When we ask questions like this, do you guys remember what kind of theories we deal with if we talk about a work in relation to its audience? The one from Abrams, it's called pragmatic. Pragmatic means we do a study on whether a work gets its meaning across and how the work impacts the audience. And when we ask questions like that, we can ask questions on whether the work succeeds in achieving its goal. If the work is a work of entertainment, we can ask whether something is successful in approaching that, or whether it manages to entertain the audience or not. Or it can also be focusing on how the audience receives the work. Does the audience like the work? Does the audience hate the work? Does the audience feel inspired by the work? So we can also study the impact on the audience. And it's usually called the reception theory or reader response criticism. So these are how you can come up with questions. And knowing this, I hope it will open a wider horizon for you to do your research in the future. And by that, I mean, I don't want you to be limited by what you can see at Universitas Matu. For example, in the library you can find such and such thesis. So, and then you feel inspired or you want to do the same thing. Now, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to go to the basic here to know that the possibility is abundant, it is limitless, and you can try to find various ways of finding questions for your research. So let this be your, I would say, your guidelines when you later decide to make a question, to come up with questions. Okay, now these are several things that I want you to think about for this week. That was what we did for last week. Now, for this week, I want you to keep in mind that we have a lot of methods in literary criticism. But there are only few methods that students have so far used in the English department, here and elsewhere, at Universitas Machung or in other universities. So I hope you can go beyond what people have done and try something else. But of course, the guideline I would say is that it is viable, it is manageable, not too ambitious, not to cover too many things and eventually makes it hard for yourself to finish it. There are so many methods or approaches in literary criticism that are manageable, that you can do within the time frame of 3 or 4 months than what people have done so far. And also important for today is that I want you to be able to distinctively identify paradigm, method, and finally approach. As for approach, I don't worry too much because this is basically what you study in Pak Dono's class. You study the various approaches in literary criticism. What we here in this class actually need to teach you or need to make sure you master is the method mostly. Paradigm is, I wouldn't worry too much about paradigm. Besides, later on when you write a thesis, you will not have to write anything about paradigm. But it is something that we need to set now for your, it will be the word building, the universe of literary criticism. Okay, now let us move on to this. We will talk briefly about paradigm, and we can cover the paradigm in a brief second over here, because Pak Patris has done the same thing, I believe, with you. And we will move on to the method and finally to approach. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will get the basics of the methods in the methodology of literary criticism. Right, now about paradigm. Paradigm is the way we perceive the world, we think about the world, and we consider anything related to a particular subject. Every walks of life has its own paradigm. The paradigm of literature is different from the paradigm of, say, religion. The paradigm, the way people see the world in religion is different from the way people see the world in, for example, anthropology. So paradigm is basically the general set of ideas to understand the world, to consider the world, or to do anything in the world. If you use the paradigm of religion in doing, for example, science, then it will not work. For example, the paradigm of religion is that at the end of the day, there is one divine being that decides everything. While in science, at least science in the world today, not science in Asgard, not the science of Thor, the science in the world today believes in an open paradigm in which there is still no limit to what we can understand or what we understand. So there are different paradigms in science and religion. Now, in literary criticism, the paradigm is different from the research in education or linguistics, for example. In linguistics, especially in syntax, yeah, or sorry, pragmatics, the paradigm is to document how people speak in the world. Why? Because if you don't document it, and language keeps evolving, and eventually languages get extinct, you will not have any record of the language. That's why the paradigm of research in linguistics, in certain fields of linguistics, is to document the linguistics phenomenon. While in literature, it's different. The paradigm in literary criticism or research in literature is to make sense or to understand literature as as a cultural system or as a cultural symptom. Sorry, not system, cultural symptom. I should correct this, I guess. Now, wait. Symptom, gejala, not system. Understand cultural symptom produced through imagination and creativity. That's our paradigm in literary research or literary criticism. We want to understand, we want to explain, we want to make sense of, we want to decipher literature. Why so? Because as I mentioned earlier, literature cannot cover everything. There are blank spaces in literature, and the blank spaces are actually interesting. Why so? Because literary works are inspired by the world sometimes. So when a work is inspired by the world, then you can see the world through the literary work. By looking at the literary work, you can somewhat see the world. People usually say that literature is the mirror of the world. Some people say that, okay? So there is the world, and there is this work, and the work is the mirror of the bigger world. So if you study a literary work, it will look like you study the world. So that's one of the principles that form this paradigm. And there's also a notion that literary work is a response to the world. How does that work? For example, okay, the world is somebody lives in a very repressive society, and when you live in this kind of situation, you cannot express yourself openly in public because maybe the government will not like it, maybe the military will not like it, or maybe other parties will not like it. So what you do is to respond to it by creating literary work. Literary work such as in Indonesia, we have a book by Seno Kumira Ajidharma called Saksi Mata. And there's also a novel called Jazz, Parfum, dan Incident. These works respond to the situation of Indonesia back during the New Order, when people could not express themselves openly. That's why one of the most quoted lines from Seno Kumira Ajidharma, for example, is ketika kebenaran dibungkam, sastra berbicara. So the literary work, sastra, is a response to that situation. It's a response to that world. But some people also write literary work as a personal release of emotion. People live in a in a sorrowful situation, in a, yeah, lives in, maybe somebody gets brokenhearted over and over and over until ambyar, right? So this person has to say something to the world as a therapy, as a release of steam. And what this person writes is, maybe this person writes a novel or a poetry or other works of literature, like songs and so on. So a literary work can be like that, and we cannot deny that. And it's also about the social psychology, symptom of social psychology. For example, okay, during the early 2000, when Indonesia just left the New Order and people were hoping to find something to hold on to other than the government, we found a lot of desperation. Some people were desperate, but some others were so relieved for that. But what eventually came out during those years were motivational literature. Literature that inspires people to do something, to achieve dreams. We have Laskar Pelangi, we have Laskar Pelangi, we have Ayat-Ayat Cinta, and we also have works like Negeri Lima Menara. These works are inspiring. These works came out and people bought them because people wanted something to hold on to, something to believe that can help them achieve, can inspire them to do something great. So it is a symptom of social psychology. The birth of motivational literature was related to the situation, the psychology of most people, which was in need of something to inspire them. And nowadays, we also still have motivational speakers, and I guess we have more than we had back then. So there might be a reason for that. Or you can also see this in the case of Korean drama, right? I've lately started reading about Korean drama, and I haven't had the chance of seeing enough Korean drama as of now. I've only seen few. And when we talk about Korean drama, we have so many emotions captured, so many problems captured, but together, these works want to show what Korea is like, what Korea looks like, what people do in Korea, what people like in Korea, what people hate in Korea. And we can read that from the perspective of what the society of Korea is actually like. And from a brief research that I did, I found out that the government of Korea in late 1990s, decided to give funding or to give subsidy to the production of popular culture, movies, songs, music, or literature. And with this subsidy, people can create literary works or movies or all those things about Korea easier. And when they have an abundance of resources, they start exporting it to outside. And eventually, people now know Korea. But the basic idea there is to introduce Korea to the world. It's what people now call the soft diplomacy, making other countries love a country using culture, not using military power, but using culture. And of course, they support that with technology, of course, right? We have Kia and we have Hyundai and Samsung and all those Korean technology around the world as well. That's to support this soft diplomacy. So a literary work can also be a symptom of social psychology, the need of Korean people to get more support from the world, more love from the world, and eventually it helps the economy of the country. And it can also be the escape from the world. Some people live in a bad situation, or some countries live in bad situation, and the people cannot just live in that. So what they have is creating a world that they can live in and live the world that they actually live in. It's quite confusing now. So they create a fictional world so that they don't have to live in the real world. And the real world is usually probably more depressing, or less fun, or too usual. And we can find this kind of work in, for example, popular culture like detective novels, fantasy literature, or even science fiction. They want to escape the world that we live now by creating another world, which is fictional, that they can enjoy, live in, and use to cope with the actual world. Now, with all these principles, then when we understand literature, then literature becomes meaningful to be understood, becomes useful. Useful not because it can make you achieve something, but it gives something to think about. It gives values, it gives inspiration, and any non-material aspects. And that's the paradigm of literary research. We try to understand literary work as a cultural symptom, but it is produced with imagination and creativity. So we cannot easily read a literary work as the perfect mirror of the society. We need to also use some analysis to understand that. And all of these natures of literature will eventually help you to understand that. Okay, now that's the paradigm. So we are not studying literature for documenting the world, just like what linguists do when they do research. We are not studying literature to create something, just like when you do experimental research in education, for example. Or we do not do literary research or literary criticism to cure cancer, just like the paradigm of research in medicine. The paradigm of this research is, again, to understand literary work as cultural symptoms. Okay, now move on to method. This is just one description of how literature actually doesn't give you a clear picture of everything in this work. The literary work might only show you the man here, or the boy, and a cat. But if you do a study, you make connections, you will eventually find, for example, oh, there's clouds. So they live in a place where it will rain, for example. And oh yeah, you have this. This might be a window pane because of this column. So it might be a window pane. So they might live in a house or in an apartment. And over there you can see small images of I don't know, buildings maybe. So you can again make inferences that they live in a city, and more pictures of the city. And there's also a sea over there, an ocean. So you can make another inference that these people live in an apartment building or in a house in a city near a coast, an ocean, and it might be raining soon. So that's what literature does to you. It shows you just a brief example of the world, and you as a literary researcher, you will need to find out the other elements, the blank spaces, so that you can get a complete world in your own perception. The funny thing is that everybody has their own perception, so the world that is understood by one literary critic can be different from the work understood by another literary critic. The key point here is that you will need to be able to substantiate, to support your interpretation of this world with valid data or with valid evidence. And by the way, do you guys know what this picture is taken from? Come on, tell me. What is it from? Let's take a brief break.
Netflix show.
Netflix show? What show?
I don't know. It's about cat. I forget the title. Oh yeah, Whisker Away.
Whisker
Yeah,
Away.
I
Okay.
Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, a Whisker Away. Right. So yeah, that's so far what I can tell you about the paradigm. But I promise to you, this discussion on the paradigm will not have to be shown in your research, but it is just to be understood, so that you do not expect something more than literary research can give you. Okay, any questions so far, everyone? Before I continue to the next stage, what do you call it in racing? Etapa selanjutnya before going to the next stage of the race. Questions? No. Okay. Now let's move on. Now the method is, of course, you know this from Pak Patrice's class. A method is the procedures for collecting data and analyzing it. And in research in linguistics and literature, what kind of method do you already know so far, or what designs do you already know and have that Patrice has explained? All right, come on, everyone, speak up. What do you still remember? Questionnaire. Okay. Questionnaire is the instrument to collect the data. It is part of a method. Questionnaire is a way to collect the data, an instrument to collect the data. The equivalent for questionnaire is interview, for example. That's another instrument. But what methods?
Quantitative and qualitative.
Okay, qualitative and quantitative. And when we talk about qualitative research or quantitative research first, what is it? A research that uses numerical data. And to interpret the numerical data, you need statistics, right? So that's quantitative method. And the qualitative method, what do you guys know so far about the qualitative method? It's open for everyone, by the way. So what? Qualitative method. A qualitative method is usually a method in which the data is qualitative, not quantitative. And what is a qualitative data? What are the characteristics of qualitative data? Speak up or write here on the chat box. Oh yeah, Dio answered a whisker away, right? Whisker away. Yeah, what are qualitative data? give me some instances of qualitative data?
Interviewing.
Come again, Tadam?
The example is interviewing. One of them is interviewing.
Okay. The results of
Question.
interviews.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Generally non-numerical.
Non-numerical.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah, anything non-numerical can be considered qualitative data. And in literature, most of the time when we talk about the method, literary research can be called, well, all of them, if not maybe 99.9%, are qualitative research. Why? Because we don't usually use numerical data in literature, except for some very sophisticated research in literature that uses, for example, big data or counting the number of certain adjectives in a work. And it is still not common at all at this point. So most literary research can be considered qualitative research because of that. However, there is something that we need to be aware, which is the fact that literary research is older than quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative method developed during the modern time when people were eager to find something that they can really see, they can rely on, and the thing that they can rely on is numbers, numerical data. That's why it's also called, sorry, the positivistic paradigm. And positivistic paradigm developed only in the 17th, 18th to 19th century in stages. Yeah. While literary research, it has been done since the ancient Greek era. So it the quantitative and qualitative. However, today, since the way people understand research is with this term, then we can say that literary research is qualitative research. Okay, sorry. So that is the first thing. But when we do research in literature, of course, there are various types of methods, not only qualitative. Now I will show you some of the methods that are around, but not all of them have been applied or used by students, whether in Universitas Madjong or elsewhere. So, right. The first method I can show you is the hermeneutic method. And hermeneutic is related to, is often also called interpretation. Or some other people would use the term understanding or verstehen. The point of hermeneutic here is to understand a work, to interpret a work, to explain, to find the meaning of the work. And it is highly influenced by the tradition of understanding the meaning of the Bible. That's why this hermeneutic approach is big in church circles or in the history of church. Basically, all works in literary criticism needs hermeneutic as a method. Hermeneutic, by this I mean understanding or interpreting or explaining the meaning of things. And in our study here in the English department of Universitas Madjong, inferential reading, which is basically a way to make meaning out of a text, and you need to interpret to do that. So no matter what approach later you use, you will still need to use interpretation to make meaning out of a statement. However, some people use hermeneutic as the only approach, okay? So you try to explain the meaning of a poem, for example, to people so that people can understand the meaning of a one-line poem well. So there are people who use hermeneutic, pure hermeneutic approach. Although now it is not very common, as you need to get wider perspective on things, not just from the text. And that's why hermeneutic is just one of the ways that you will use. And the second one, which is the most common one, is the descriptive qualitative method. I think the name here is quite explanatory, right? By descriptive here, researchers usually describe the meaning or the elements of a text. If it is a novel, then this researcher describe maybe the characterization, or maybe the plot, or maybe the settings. And this is also called qualitative because the data that you get from the text is data in its nature, natural data, non-numerical. And this qualitative data that you get from the text includes, for example, sentences, or words, or even passages, several pages at the same time. Or if you study not the work, but the writer, for example, the qualitative data will include the statement of the writer, the story of the writer about where she lives, what kind of family she grows up in, what kind of country she lives in, and so on. So it's descriptive, qualitative. You describe a set of qualitative data when you do the research. This is what I mentioned as the most common method that students of literature like to do. Almost all of research in Universitas Machung are descriptive, qualitative. But of course, there are some that are not descriptive and qualitative. And there's also this so-called descriptive analysis or descriptive analytical method. Like all descriptive research, it tries to describe, to explain the elements of the work. But here, you also try to analyze it. Analyzing here, I mean, you see the connection between elements. You see the connection between, you try to explain how something is related to something else. For example, you can describe the characterization, you can describe the settings, you can describe the plot, but then you try to make connections between the setting and the characterization. The character who is wild and brave is there described in, for example, living in a tight space, a small house without any garden, without any view in the window. So you will find some contradiction there. So you try to find relations between these elements that you have described. What we call the descriptive analysis or descriptive analytical. There's also content analysis. And here, when you do a research using content analysis, you focus on what meaning someone can get out of a text. And most people use content analysis when they study non-fictional elements. For example, travel writing, and you want to know how certain writers describe nature in the writing, and how people will get the meaning of the description of nature. Last year, as an example, I did a research on travel writings in the Jakarta Post, the newspaper. In those travel writings, I picked 30 travel writings. I tried to describe how, actually, I tried to explain how these writers describe nature. And to be more specific, not just how they describe nature, but how they describe nature in relation to human. Do they describe nature as an important thing that human cannot live with, or do they describe nature as something that humans need to keep living? The first one, if you describe nature as something that that can live by itself without needing human, it's called the ecocentric. You see the world in which nature is the center. Nature is the most important thing. So when you see it that way, as a human, you don't really need to, you don't really consider the need of human. But if you describe nature as something that human can use, humans need, human can exploit, then you see the world in an anthropocentric way. The center of your world is human. So I tried to see how this travel writing projects that, and what I found out was that most writers, when they describe nature, they describe nature as something that is there for human, something that human can enjoy for its benefit, for its wealth, like for its products, for its minerals, and so on. And very few writers, when they write about nature, see nature as the top most important thing. See nature as something that will still be there and doesn't need human. When human goes extinct, nature will still be there. So we as humans need to be aware of that and not see ourselves as the most important thing and as the creature that can exploit nature. That's content analysis. So you analyze the content and how it might mean to you. You don't talk about the intention of the writer. Okay, there is, in Indonesian we have the term makna, and we also have the term niat, arti and makna. Sometimes arti is what the writer intentionally wants to tell the audience, but makna or meaning is something that you as an audience get out of the text. So meaning is what we want to focus on, the meaning, or how we see the thing, how we see the object. So that's content analysis. You analyze the content. And there's also a formal method. Formal method is related to form, of course. Formal is from the word forms. And when you do a formal analysis, when you use the formal method, you don't really consider everything else outside the work. You see the work as an independent, as a whole unit, and its value comes from its completeness. And if we relate it to literature, usually we work with the realization that literary work is a complete thing, and every part is related to everything else. And what you have studied from Pak Dono's class as an example or as an approach for formal method is the structuralism. Structuralism, or earlier people call it Russian formalism or new criticism. These are the approach of literature towards literature that don't consider external elements or extrinsic elements. You only focus on in poetry, you only focus on the figurative language, the rhymes, or the rhythms, and everything else that is forms. Okay, that is related to the form of the work. You can do this formal study on literary work. If you study literary work using theories of deconstruction, for example, it is considered a formal study because you focus mostly on that work. And last one, but not least, I want to highlight this approach, which many people have been doing, and yet we still need more in it. It's called the descriptive comparative method. As a descriptive research, what you do here is you describe the meanings of elements, right? The elements of literary work. But you make comparisons between the elements of this work and the elements of another work. The other work can be literary works. If you study a novel, the other one can be another novel. So you compare the elements of this novel to find, for example, how the novel A describes women differently than how the novel B does it. Or you can also make the comparison between the work and its adaptation in the forms of movies or songs or paintings. So this is also descriptive comparative. You try to describe and then compare the elements of this work. I happen to have done this quite a lot in my career as a scholar. I might have told you that my degree, my master's and doctoral degrees, are in comparative literature and cultural studies. So descriptive comparative is pretty much my playground, my stomping ground. I do a lot of comparative studies between literary works across culture, between literary works in the same area but by different writers, or between a work and its movie adaptations. So this is something that you can do a lot. Our students here at Universitas Machung have done works on this. For example, 2 years ago we had Natasha. Natasha did a study on what do you call it? Long fiction, light novel, a light novel and its anime adaptation. I forget the name of the light novel. Was it Story of My Life? Oh no, something. Oh my God, I cannot remember. So she made a comparison between the work and its adaptation in the forms of a novel. And another student made a comparison between a game and its movie adaptation. It was Eben, if I'm not mistaken. There was an Indonesian game that he analyzed in relation to, he compared to the movie adaptation of that game. It's a ghost game. I forget the name of the game. I'm sorry, I'm bad at that. But basically, this is something that you can do. You can make a comparison between works and describe the comparison and eventually come up with some kind of judgment, I would say, which one is more interesting, which one is more ethical, which one is more friendly towards women, which one is more class conscious, and so on. I once saw a very good comparative study on the short story, Philosophy Copy by Dewi Lestari, and its movie adaptation. The scholar, the researcher, compared the elements of these two works and came up with the argument that the movie version of this story is well, it projects women, it shows women in an objectivist perspective. The female character is there for the viewers to see. They objectify the woman. However, the movie adaptation also shows the woman as somebody with agency, not just there for you to see, although there is that, but it also shows that women can also hold leadership roles in the movie. So that's what she argued in her article. The ambivalent description of men, or the ambiguous description of women in the adaptation of philosophy copy from a short story into a movie. Here also you can do a study on comparing the translation of a work by one person and the translation by another person. I showed you the comparison between the translation of The Old Man and the Sea by Yuni Kristianingsih and the one by Sapardi Djoko Damono in our literary translation class. Now, what I showed over there is only how Sapardi Djoko Damono is more into preserving the meaning, preserving the accuracy, while Yuni Kristianingsih is more into delivering something that is more emotional and smooth, right? You can also do something else. You can also do a study on how a translator is more, for example, okay, more friendly towards minorities in the translation, because she changes some terms in the translation to make it sound more friendly towards minority, while another translator is not. That is just one way of comparing translations. That is something you can do. And these are all the 6 methods that I hope can get you started. First of all, whether you only interpret the work without involving anything else, you interpret the meaning to get to the most optimum meaning of the text, or you can also describe the qualitative data from the text with the help of other theories from outside. You can describe the meaning of a text with the help of other theories, but then you find the connections between these elements, just like in descriptive analysis. You can also do analysis on the content of the work and how you understand it as a reader in content analysis. You can focus mostly on the work to show the completeness, the wholeness, or the strength of a particular work, which is called the formal analysis. And finally, you can describe the elements of literary work and compare them to those of other work, or the adaptation of the same work in a different form, whether it be a movie or a song and so on. So these are the 6 methods you can try to apply later on. Now, about the approaches, approaches are what you use to get closer to the text. To get closer means to make you understand the text better, to explain the text. And these approaches are what you actually have studied in Pak Dono's class, so I don't have to spend too much time in this part. Yeah, now I have to go back to Abrams. here to remind you of the 4 elements in studying literature: the work, the artist or the writer, the audience or the reader, and the universe or the world. The understanding of these 4 elements will help direct will help focus your attention when you do your research. If you want to study the work in relation to the universe, then you will use the mimetic theories about the similarity between the work and the world. And you do this because you consider the work and the world are similar, then you use the theories of science or knowledge about the world in understanding your work, your literary work. And if you want to study the work in relation to the audience in what we call the pragmatic approach, you can do that. You can do your research there, and you will need to see whether a work is successful in delivering the message or getting its message across, or whether the work succeeds in affecting the audience. And lastly, you can also talk about the work in relation to the artist, the writer. Here, you will make an attempt to understand how a work comes into being, what situation makes a writer write this, okay? You can talk here about the motivation of the writer, as I showed you earlier. Now, these are what I just mentioned to you, the critical theories that you can use, subjective or expressive, if you study the work in relation to the writer. So how is the writer's ideology reflected in work? That is one question you can pose. And somebody used a question similar to this last week when we talked about, when I asked you to make a question about the aged mother. And in mimetic theories, you can pose questions like, what does the text tell us about a particular culture? Now, you can also ask this kind of question in relation to the aged mother, like what kind of society do these people live in? A despotic society with a mayor or a governor who can ask anything and people have to comply with it. And a pragmatic approach can be, how does a text affect the readers? Many of you 2 weeks ago attended Yayang's presentation on her research, and she posed questions like, what are the elements of romance that the writer uses, and then how do these elements of romance affect the readers? And to answer the question, Yayang has to interview a lot of several readers of the webtoons to get into the meaning. So that is called a pragmatic approach. That is something rare that students at Universitas Madjong, not many students have done. And objective approach is when you talk about the work alone, focusing on the work without any questions about something else. You can ask about how the work describes racism, for example, describes sexism, describes classism, and many things. But when you ask questions like this, usually it will not be complete if you don't relate it to theories from other fields of studies. Now, this is where the approaches come. We have various approaches that you can use to study literary works. The first one being the biographical approach. The biographical approach here uses the life of the writer or the situation of the writer to explain, or the ideology of the writer to explain about a work. My master's thesis was on a novel called Takwakor. It is considered a blasphemous novel. Blasphemous means against the creeds of religion. If an Indonesian wrote that novel today, people would be very mad. Now, the novel is an American novel by an American Muslim writer. It's about punk rock kids living in one house, doing a lot of punk rock stuff that might offend everyday Muslims. What I tried to do was to explain what in the writer's life motivated him to write this novel. So for that, I also used the life of the writer and the experience of the writer and the Muslim ideology of that surrounds the writer that maybe he once believed in, but then he rejected. And I also talked about the punk ideology, punk rock ideology that makes the novel reasonable at the end. So this is something you can do, biographical approach. You can also use a sociological approach, which includes theories in feminism, Marxism, and post-colonial studies. That's why I don't have to mention much here, because you have done this with Adorno, right? So you can use those approaches. An anthropological approach can include eco-critical theories about how human sees nature, how human treats nature, and how it is important for us to raise awareness of nature. That's included in anthropological. I believe you are all familiar between the relationship between sociology and anthropology. Sociology about the structure of the society, while anthropology is more about humans and how humans live their lives. And psychological approaches. Psychological approach is the most common approach that students use, whether it be psychoanalysis or other theories in psychology, like developmental psychology or psychology of work psychology, the psychology of work, like what I like reading now, which is the one by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He talks about how some people eventually enjoy work to a degree that they feel like they are in ecstasy while working. So that's also in psychology. That's what you can do. And mimetic, showing the similarity between the work and the real world. And you use a lot of theories from the fields of sociology and other fields of studies, and so on. These are all the approaches that you can use. And again, approach is a way to get closer into the text, a way to understand the text better. These are what help you explain the text. And method, as I need to review again, method is a set of procedures to gather your data and analyze the data. And paradigm is the way you see the entire project of literary criticism. And in literary criticism, the paradigm is to understand literary work as a cultural symptom, but it is produced through imagination and creativity. So these are what I wanted to tell you earlier. Now, the question is, what method should you use? What approach should you use when you study literature? Can anyone try to explain? What method do you have to use? Okay, now you can try answering this. Oh yeah, thread out. That's the game. Thread out. So how do you decide your method, guys? Sorry, I didn't see the chat box while doing the presentation. What method will you use now? How do you decide what method to use? The answer is pretty simple. It depends on your question. And it depends on the questions and your objectives, what you want to achieve through the literary studies. If you want to understand what motivated the writer to write this work, then maybe your method is descriptive qualitative, because you use qualitative data from the life of the writer and from the work, and then you describe the data. So it's descriptive qualitative, but the approach is biographical. You use this elements, the biography of the writer, to explain that. If you want to answer questions like why is the king afraid of old people, then it might be something that you can explain using the theory of psychology, but the method is maybe again you will need to do descriptive qualitative. And if you want to study, for example, if you ask questions whether this movie is good or bad, or whether the movie is more gender friendly towards the audience, then your method might be the descriptive comparative. You will need to compare the the movie to the novel version, for example, and you describe that. So these are all that you can use. And if you answer about the gender friendliness of a movie, then the approach that you will use is the sociological approach, focusing mostly on theories in feminism. That's just one example. Now we have the adhan, which means it's already 2:35. Now questions, please. Yeah, this is one additional thing that I wanted to give you. Many of you might not have any idea about what you will write in literature, in your research. The secret is very simple, actually. Go read the work, or watch the movie, or listen to the songs, or anything that you want to study. Read further, and eventually you will get questions in your head. Questions about the blank spaces in that song, in that movie, in that novel. And your research will be, your next job is to formulate your curiosity, your questions into a research question or research problem, and then later on you can decide the method and the approach. So that's it. The question of your research will come from attention. If you pay attention to things, then you will get more questions, and then you will eventually be able to find the topic of for a research.